All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. If you're a subscriber to my channel or view my website or just a friend of mine, you know my tastes in music are very eclectic. Particularly with my podcast, I've had members from Einstürzende Neubauten and Rainbow. So it kind of gives you an idea of how varied things are in my mind and in my musical collection. But very rarely, if ever, have I been able to explore all these different genres I love with one guest. So it's a real delight for me to welcome someone who's had a history unlike most, if not all, guests I've had on this channel. We have multiple opportunities for multiple directions. Uh, Short of having this be a 6-hour podcast, we can go in a lot of different directions. So, with that said, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Mr. Greg Langston. Greg, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Joel. I'm really happy to be here this afternoon.
Yeah, it's one of those situations, man, where I know we're gonna hit various topics and hopefully give a nice spotlight to some things musically that I think my viewers would love if they haven't heard it before. But let's start with the here and now and the main reason why we've connected. You've played in a vast assortment of bands, various styles, various eras, which we'll get into. But the reason why initially we got in touch was because in a few weeks, September 12th to be exact, there's going to be a fantastic archival release from one of your former bands, which is the Sea Hags. And I have a readership and viewership that came up in my generation. We're all hard rock fans from the 80s. So
Hmm.
quite a few people know that name. For those who don't, the Sea Hags were a band, put out one major label album in 1989 on Chrysalis Records, an eponymous record. Half the Way Valley was the single off that record, and people my generation remember seeing that on MTV. So it was that kind of band in that era. However, rewinding the Sea Hag's tale, you are the original drummer in that band, and initially the Sea Hags were a three-piece and a much more stripped down, more raucous, I dare say a bit punkier band than what was represented on that classic album that we all still know. And your incarnation of the band is represented in a release called Dead and Gone. Comes out September 12th on Liberation Hall, the great Liberation Hall, who've put out tremendous reissues and archival releases in the last few years. So, from what I understand, this recording is essentially a live demo from 1985, so 40 years ago, and not done terribly long after the band started. I believe this was your second demo as a group. So let's start there. First of all, it sounds fantastic. For a live demo recorded 40 years ago, sonically, it definitely holds up. Um, what were the roads taken to get a Sea Hags release after 40 years, out into the world finally in this way?
Well, it was a little tricky here because Chris Losshart passed away in 1991, I believe, and then Ron Yoakum, the guitar player, main singer, he's just really hard to find. He's somewhere in San Francisco, but I don't think he's doing real well, and so he's pretty hard to track down. I spent about 2 years with Liberation Hall and just stalling, not really stalling, but trying to get Ron's permission to just go ahead and do this. And then the our old lawyer that we worked with for a long time ago said, just go ahead and put it out. We'll sort it out. It should be fine. Um, Now, the recording wasn't actually the very um second demo. We'd been in the studio a few times before. Now, this was a almost like a little mini concert because we invited about 60 people And we were in a professional recording studio, CD Studios. We had Sylvia Massey, who's a turned out to be a top name. She was still not as big a name back then, and uh, she was behind the board, and we basically played a live show in front of about 60 or so people that were really, really enthusiastic. I mean, we said, okay, everybody cheer after every song or whatever. And people did. And, they drank a little beer and, at whatever, 2 in the afternoon. But we came out with a pretty good selection of songs, probably not all of our songs, but, enough that we could go ahead and turn this into a good recording. Um, we did put it out on not the whole show, but we chopped it up a little bit, and a few songs came out on cassette.
Mm.
Um, the other recording that I had, we called the Hag of the Sea, and I sold that out of the back of my car at every show, and I would just sell them out immediately. So that was done in a much smaller studio, but the recording that is being released was a top-notch studio. We ran through our songs. If we thought we could do another version better, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 songs that we did twice, but we went ahead and picked the best versions. And I have some pretty fond memories of that day and just being a whole lot of fun. Now, it was 40 years ago, but right around that time, I was with the Sea Hags from 1985 through sometime in 1988, and we played. I have a list of all the shows, but about 300 shows in my time with them, which is a pretty substantial number. Now, by the time this recording came out, we were just so comfortable playing together. I mean, we when there's that level of comfort with playing with people, things come out really, really well.
Mm.
There would be times when we would practice a new song in the afternoon and just go for it. As a live show the that evening. We were that comfortable doing things sometimes. So anyway, I think that that answers the question about how did this come about. And basically, I've had this one recording sitting around for a long time, and I think it's just time that it gets heard.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's got a wonderful vibe to it, to give those who haven't heard it yet somewhat of a perspective. It's not it's not a Sylvia Massey production circa 1995. It's not that big, and it's not a cassette in someone's back pocket. It's a really nice mix of the two where you're listening to a live band and you're in the setting. The energy of this recording puts the listener there. But I think it serves as really a functional album as well, especially because a lot of that material hasn't been heard before song-wise. A couple of the tracks ended up on that first album that Crystal has put out. But this represents certainly an earlier style of the band. You were, like I said, a lot more on the punk side of things, perhaps than what later became that 89 album, which is a wonderful album, but it sounds like a 1989 album from a hard rock band. This one's got a bit more color to it. Um, but sticking with 85, when that whole thing started with the three of you, because you had been around for a few years, and we'll definitely get into that. Um, how did you cross paths with the other two fellows to begin with to start what became the initial version of the band?
I think our initial meeting, I completely can't remember, but I was playing with a group called Fade to Black at the time, who were some really, really good friends, and they kind of came out of more of the goth kind of side of things, and I think that the reason I played with Fade to Black was because I had um, just come back from England, um, from playing with a band called Beast, which had Brian from the Cramps in it.
Mhm.
And I needed to jump into something that was comfortable right away. So, anyway, I was playing with Fade to Black, and I met up with Ron and Chris. And I got to just say that Ron can talk people into absolutely anything. So I went ahead and brought them into our studio, Turk Street Studios, a notorious uh, dump of a studio in one of the worst parts of town. Anyway, the Nights Fade to Black wasn't practicing. I brought Ron and Chris down there, and we played a few times and got together a little set. And then right across the street from this notoriously bad rehearsal place was the absolute worst little club right across the street called The Sound of Music. The Sound of Music is just legendary for being right in the worst part of town, the Tenderloin. And we just moved the gear right across the street. And I think we did our first four shows at The Sound of Music. Well, what started to happen was people actually started to take notice, and um, we got. I could see that there was something here, and that things were going to be. Looks like it was going to be a popular band. Not only that, is that style of music is really fun as a drummer to play. You don't have to, it's something that even before the punk rock days, I was, in my teenage bedroom with my headphones on, playing to, hard rock music. Well, um, after the first few shows, that came to a point where I had to tell the Fade to Black members, I got to pick one. The
Mhm.
Sea Hags are just getting more and more popular, and there was some lineup changes that were about to happen with Fade to Black. And as soon as they got themselves settled, I said, well, I'm going to stick with the Sea Hags. And you know, I'm still great friends with those band members today. The bass player Jeff was my bass player in No Alternative, who I still play with. Um, Not with Jeff, but with a different bass player. And that's kind of how it started. And then we got put on some big shows as the opening act at this place called The Farm. And we started to open for bigger bands like Dead Kennedys and the Subhumans, and mostly mostly the punk bands. And what was happening is we were playing kind of a stripped down older style rock and roll to the punk crowd. And I didn't really know if this was going to really go over very well, because this is initially the kind of things that we were getting away from in the earlier days. But it turns out that with Ron and Chris up there as really good show people, and me back there who had the punk credibility, um, people ate it up. People, I think there was a lot of people that were actually missed hearing sounds which they grew up with. And I think with the a little bit of credibility there, it didn't feel like you were listening to an old 70s band. It sounded a lot more fresh.
Right. And a great point about the punk credibility. I think today some more casual listeners miss the fact that circa 85, where you guys were, but certainly in LA too, there was this transition where a lot of the old punk guys from that first wave were doing more traditional rock and roll or hard rock leaning stuff. One example being in LA Guns, you had Nicky Beat from the Weirdos and the Germs. He was in that band. Um, TSOL obviously became more of a hard rock band. But even the benchmark, we'll say, from California, Guns N' Roses, Duff was a hardcore guy, so there was a lot of transitioning from that first era of punk into this more, hard rock stylized stuff. And I've always found that very interesting. that quite a few people made that transition, and that seems to be forgotten. Even though, like, the Sea Hags, you also play with, X and suicidal tendencies. Um,
Oh, the list is the
yeah,
list is really, really endless. I
and it
mean,
made sense to do that. Whereas today, I think people would scratch their heads a bit more than maybe in '85. At least not being there myself, but that's the impression. I mean, did it make sense in those days to have these very sort of seemingly disparate people and bands doing the same things together?
it all made sense. And if you think about the earlier days in the 60s, what Bill Graham was doing is he would put on shows where he'd have a Jefferson Airplane, but he'd also put on a jazz person and maybe a blues act in there. Um, so it all seemed to work. I mean, the types of bands that we played with were just all over the map, and it all seemed to fit in.
Mm.
I think I think later on, there was a little bit of the glam rock stuff that was started to creep in. There was a few times we would play with bands like that. I think we did play with LA Guns one time. That would have been one of the bigger ones, but you know, we were playing with the Cramps a few times, and we played with Motorhead, and we played with Ramones, and we just got exposed to all sorts of different audiences. There was all the LA groups. There was a time when we would go from San Francisco to LA about twice a month, and then we'd play up and down the coast, and we got to play with so many great groups, and we just started to get bigger and bigger and started to play in bigger places, and then sometimes we'd play in some little small place too, and that would be just fine. But I we're also talking 40 years ago, and if I didn't keep really good records of what I've done, I would have forgotten a lot of this stuff. But I did keep a lot of archival material, flyers, and anything that came my way. And a lot of this stuff was stuck up in my attic for many years, and then I pulled it down and put it all together, and I got my memories.
Excellent. To the point of that spirit of eclecticism that was around in those days, I know that early Sea Hags had a very big supporter in Kirk Hammett from Metallica, to the point where Kirk, like, quite literally worked with you. He played guitar a little bit on your demo, your first demo, and produced it. Um, which I think is beautiful because it speaks to the heart of what we've been talking about. But how did the Kirk connection come to be?
Oh, through Ron Yoakum. Somehow along the line, the two of them started hanging out, and Kirk heard our music. I don't remember him coming to a show in particular, but all of a sudden he was just kind of there and happy to be working with us. And I got to say, Kirk is really, honestly, one of the coolest guys. I mean, he was definitely the coolest guy in that band that I knew. I did at one point run across James Hetfield and Lars, um, and we had a drunken night at my house. But Kirk wasn't there, and probably a good thing. But Kirk was wonderful to work with, and he did play guitar on one of the tracks called "Love Kills," and I think it was renamed on the 1989 album to, was it Under the Night Stars? I think was the name of that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So yeah, Kirk was great to work with, and um, I have a funny little story too. Is um, Kirk didn't really know that much about punk rock, so he said, "Would you make me a cassette of some of your favorite stuff?" And I said, "Yeah, you got to get me a T-shirt though. I'm not just giving going to make you a cassette." So I made him a cassette, and he got me a funny T-shirt that said "Metal up your ass" on it, with a toilet with
Yeah.
a sword through it. And so I made him this CD of a lot of classic early punk, a lot of kind of funny punk and non-PC punk and stuff like that. And apparently, the band would listen to this cassette while they were traveling around the country. So fast forward a little bit, um, they put out an EP called the Garage Days Revisited.
Right.
Well, they came out with an expanded version of that, which was I have as a two record set,
Mhm.
and a song on there by the Anti Nowhere League called "So What" popped up on there, and that's one of the ones that I'd put on the cassette for those guys. So I don't know for sure, but I mean, it seems likely that there was a little influence in there.
Yeah.
And this was all around the time of their third album, because I remember that it was right around the time of their third album that that they came that all came to be.
Yeah. Well, I know certainly they are. I've never worked with anyone in Metallica, but I have a lot of 6 degrees of separation with them. Quite a few people I've worked with have worked with them, and they seem very intent on discovering new music and very intent on supporting different music. You know, you raised the point about that covers album. How many people were introduced to the Anti-Nowhere League or the Misfits or Killing Joke or any one of those bands they covered because they covered them? You know, I mean, there are people who, have a lot of meals paid for to this day because Metallica covered their songs, so
That's probably true, isn't it? Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But then on that Garage Days Revisited, they also had songs by Budgie and Diamond Head. And
yeah.
see, I learned about those bands through that record. And now I have a bunch of Budgie records. So,
Oh yeah. Yeah. And that
so
we could probably do a whole podcast just talking about Budgie. I mean, what a
oh yeah,
cool sort of overlooked band. And Diamond Head, I mean that great band from the era, that's that late 70s, early 80s era. And they're still playing, and Brian Tatler, the guitarist, still sings Metallica's praises for, you know, giving them a chance to play for another 30 plus years or whatever it's been. So, very cool.
that's
Um,
really cool.
yeah, and I know I have done some work at a band over the years called Electric Frankenstein. And
Oh, with Scotty?
yeah, I was post Scotty. I think I
Okay.
I missed Scotty by about a year the first time. I played in EF, but yeah, it was about a year after Scotty had left the band. But I know Scotty. Scotty's been on the podcast.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, great guy, great guy. But I know for a fact that Hetfield is a big Electric Frankenstein fan and has talked the band up a few times. So thank you, James.
When when we would play, we played a lot of shows with Scotty's band, Verbal Abuse, at the
Hmm,
time, and Scotty was the second singer for Verbal Abuse, and right around that time in the mid '80s, they were absolutely on fire. What a band! They still play now, but they have Nikki Sickie back, their original singer,
right.
so they're on tour.
Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing to see who is still active. And Scotty's got a band, the Infamous Stiffs.
Yeah, I just saw them a couple weeks ago.
Cool. How was it?
Oh, he was good, but he was sick. And I found out he had COVID. And then all of a sudden, I caught it
Oh,
like next week.
oh no.
Yeah, we have a lot of people at that. I mean, he was a trooper for coming up there and playing, but a few people didn't feel very well a couple days afterwards.
Sorry to hear that. Well, Scotty,
Yeah,
hope you're doing well. And see, people, COVID is still out there, so be careful.
yeah, they were great though. They were fabulous.
Yeah, yeah, that most recent record of theirs is really good. And I've always been a fan of Scotty's voice, for sure. Um, so fast forward a little bit with the Sea Hags to kind of put a period on next. I definitely want to hit you about some other things.
Sure, sure.
You and the band part ways. They bring in Adam Maples to play drums, who did that album on Chrysalis. And I think he may have auditioned for Guns N' Roses, had a cup of coffee with Guns N' Roses, something around that time as well. But like a lot of bands of that era, they get to the major and it's a one and done. A very few bands that cropped up at that point got to do that second record. Um, do you have insight into why that, although you weren't in the band at that point, why, they had the video, they had the album, and then it just seemed to sort of, puff in the thin air, and that was the end of the Sea Hags.
Oh, I sure do. But now a lot of this was, I have to say, once I left the band, and I was asked to leave during pre-production for that Chrysalis record. Um, that was produced by Mike Klink, who was really on top of the world with Guns N' Roses right then, and uh, he brought in Adam and another guitar player. He thought that they needed another guitar player to play to beef up the sound, and I think that Mike Klink wanted uh, Adam to basically play my parts,
Mm.
and um, Ron and Chris probably could have stuck up for me, but I think that there was a lot of money being thrown around right around that time, and they had this promise to them that, hey, you make these changes and you're going to be even bigger right now. And Ron and Chris and the management, they took the bait on that. And I was sent home, and kind of with my tail between my legs here, and you know a lot of people, what happened, and I didn't want to talk to anybody. I disappeared for a month and went to Australia. But but I think that what happened after that record came out, and that record in in my mind and in many other people's mind sounds like a 19 what was it, 1991 it came out, or 1989, I guess. Oh,
89.
89.
Yeah, that was
Yeah, it sounds like an LA rock band of that
right.
era. And Ron and Chris, that's what they wanted. They saw what was going on with Guns N' Roses and LA Guns, and that wasn't really necessarily what, um, in my mind, we were really aiming for. Not really, because, like I say, we played with so many eclectic groups.
Mm.
Now, I'm still in contact with our old road manager, and he thinks that the drug addiction that Ron and Chris had really contributed to the real downfall. And what I understand is that um, when it came time to buckle down and work on a new set of songs for a second album, they just didn't do it.
Mm.
And when Chrysalis came out and said, "Okay, you guys, where's your material?" It was pretty weak in what they were coming up with. And I think that I'm saying I think because I wasn't really in contact with them, but I certainly heard a lot, is that they had just gotten a little bit too far into the drug scene. And I think Ron and Chris had some some tangles between them, and they were a tight songwriting team. I mean, the two of them together could really write a song. But I think that I can tell you the way that Ron was probably thinking was, we're the Sea Hags, man. We can just do no wrong. And, you know, when there's a lot of money involved and they are putting stuff, you know, they're putting this behind you, you gotta deliver. You can't, this is the time that you're supposed to work the hardest. And I think they just didn't work the hardest. I think that there was a lot of glory at that time with, people like Johnny Thunders and their drug use. And I just didn't really have part of that aspect of what was going on with the group. There was a time when Chris told me, and this really surprised me. He said, "You know what? Ron's high right now." And I said, "Oh, he just seems regular to me." And he goes, "No, look at his eyes."
Mhm.
And this stuff was happening right in front of me, and I couldn't tell.
Yeah.
One time I was in my apartment, and my roommate said, "Greg, I found a syringe in the bathroom." And somehow I must have just kind of blown that off. But I mean, those drugs are a pretty bad thing. You know, I'm pretty fortunate that I just never had to go go that route. So
Yeah. Yeah. Shame the band ended that way. Obviously, that's a very common story for multiple bands. I'm glad the Chrysalis album was made, and I'm really glad Dead and Gone is coming out because I think it represents something else with the Sea Hags. Like I said earlier, it represents that more raw, down and dirty, a little bit looser, a little bit punkier kind of vibe to it. As much as I'm a big fan of hard rock of the 80s and the production that went along with it, I think the production in a lot of those records were kind of like the fifth or sixth member of the band, right? Um,
sure.
and I grew up on that stuff, so I'm a big Mike Kling fan as a listener. I like his production work. But Dead and Gone is cool because it's sort of the other side of the coin. It's like what happens when you take away that kind of sheen and just put a band on stage and say, go, and sometimes that is what defines a band more than how a studio makes them sound. Can they pull it off on stage? And that's what I think Dead and Gone offers. It offers a glimpse of that band firing on all cylinders, doing it live, you know. And it's cool to hear it 40 years later, or in my case, 36 years after the first album, you know. So definitely cool to have it out there. I did want to hit you with some other stuff. And like I said, we can do a 6-hour podcast. I don't think either one of us has the bandwidth for that at the moment. But going back to your early career, and I'm so thrilled to have you because I can finally talk to somebody who's a guest on my podcast about one of the most fascinating bands I've ever encountered. I cannot adore Tuxedo Moon more. And Tuxedo Moon was your very first band when you were 19 years old. Interesting way to start, I have to imagine, working with that bunch of people. Um, so tell me a bit about them and the era you were a part of. I'm a particularly big fan of that first couple of years, late 70s, early 80s Tuxedo Moon. First of all, the characters are obviously very colorful in those lineups back then. How did your entry point into Tuxedo Moon take place?
Um, well, there was this radio show called The Heretics, and The Heretics was Howie Klein and Cosmo Topper, and it was on between 2 and 4 in the morning. And I would either make sure that I was home at 2 o'clock to record it, or I would wake up at 2 o'clock and record it. This is how a lot of people heard a lot of the underground music of the time. And I had heard Tuxedo Moon's very first single, uh, Joe Boy, the Electronic Ghost, and Pinhead's on the Move.
Mm.
And so, I would listen to those songs along with all the other stuff that was going on. And lo and behold, the first EP came out, which has No Tears on it
Hmm.
and a few other songs on it too. So I bought it the day that it came out, actually. And I was calling Aquarius Records and saying, "Is it out yet? Is it out yet?" So um, I would, whenever I had a record that I really liked, I would come home and I'd put on the headphones and I'd play to it. So I was listening to the Heretics show one night and they said Tuxedomoon needs a drummer. Now I had seen Tuxedomoon perform with Paul Zoll, who's an amazing drummer. He's had a super long career himself, and I'd seen them play, and I I had already put my feelers out for a band to play with in the punk scene. I had talked to KGB, which had turned into No Alternative, who I actually still play with, and they had just found another drummer, and so that was off the table. But I went into a rehearsal, the first rehearsal with Tuxedomoon, and I could play 6 songs
Mm.
already because I had 4 songs from the EP, 2 from the single, and then they threw a couple more songs at me, and from the very first day, I could play the songs, and I'd had a teenage band before that, so it's not really the very first. I played gigs and played shows, but not really in the San Francisco nightclubs. Well, we started practicing in late 1978, and the first show was early February at a club called the Deaf Club.
Hmm.
And we had the Deaf Club shows, and then we had Mabuhay shows, and we just all of a sudden here I'm 19 years old and in a in a headlining band. We did a show at the Mabuhay, and the Cramps played under us. And I was like, wow, this is a blast. Uh, we went down to we went down to Los Angeles, and then we did a little tour around New York and all of that. And here I'm 19 years old, um, just getting my feet wet in this whole thing. So I got to do all that with them, plus record a 45 called "The Stranger." With it came out as Winston Tong and Tuxedomoon, but it was basically one of the just one of the songs in the set that Winston happened to sing. Um, and then the other side was called Love/No Hope, and it's a cool song too. So that was one of my very first records. And then also an album came out called Live at the Deaf Club, which was a compilation, which has Tuxedomoon, Dead Kennedys, Offs, Pink Section, and the Mutants,
Hmm.
and KGB. So I play drums on that record, which we did a version of 19th Nervous Breakdown, the old Rolling Stones song, and then a song out of the movie Eraserhead called In Heaven. And it's kind of a twisted little thing, but if you end up listening to the Live at the Deaf Club album, you can actually get kind of a sense of what things were like in San Francisco at the time. The other band was called the Offs,
Hmm.
and the Offs were they were a punk band, but they ended up having a little bit of reggae thrown in there. So interesting thing about the Live at the Deaf Club album is KGB turned into No Alternative, who I still play with. The Offs reformed, and I played with the Offs as in a reformed version. Um, and also and play on the Tuxedomoon tracks. And then I'm also kind of the fill-in drummer for the Mutants now. So you've got like, let's see, is that three or four bands that on that album that I'm actually related to? And even though I filled in for the Mutants and we did a reformation of the Offs, you still got to learn a whole set of songs,
Hmm.
I mean, anytime you do something like this, you're learning anywhere between 12 and like, well, with the Mutants, like 20 songs. So that album has a real solid place in my heart. Plus me and my daughter, who's a junior graphic designer, put together a book about the Deaf Club. And through my music connections, um, I got flyers, photographs, and I mean, I know everybody in the San Francisco punk scene. So, I mean, I do, and people are happy to talk to me about it. And so we put together a little book, which is flyers and photos, and uh, it's sold out in a week. So, and then my daughter's off doing other things, so I don't think there'll be another pressing of that. But anyway, that's kind of my Tuxedomoon story. Is I came out, did a couple of recordings, and then there's a double live album, or there's a double compilation album called Pinheads on the Move, and there's one other live track from when we played at Madame Wong's in Los Angeles from that. And then later on, I think it's just a Bandcamp recording, but there's live at Max's Kansas City. There's a couple tracks that I play on from live at Max's Kansas City. On you can go to a Tuxedomoon Bandcamp, and you can find that. And I do a wonderful version of their song "No Tears."
Mm.
And when we were in New York, we were joined by Michael Belfer, who was in the Sleepers. So we had Michael Belfer performing on those tracks, and then a little bit later on, I I in 1984 I formed a band with Michael Belfer and played with him, and now I play with a band called the Sleepers AD, which has the only surviving member of the original band. But yeah, Paul Draper. And turns out we're going to play tomorrow in Oakland. So
Fantastic. Fantastic.
yeah, and everybody in the Sleepers AD has a little bit of a connection to the original Sleepers, and some of it's just through playing with Michael. And then our singer has been friends with Paul Draper and put out his one of his first records on Paul Draper's label in around 1980 or so. So I mean, we all have these connections to the original Sleepers. Plus, they were absolutely one of my favorite bands, and I just loved Michael Belfer's guitar playing, and I was really sad when he passed away a couple of years ago.
Yeah, Michael Belfer is one of my top three favorite guitar players. The others being
So good.
Andy Gill from Gang of Four and
Oh
Jordy
yeah.
Killing Joke. I put Belfer up there with those two. What a talent. Listen to the guitar solo on Linda on the first Sleeper 7-inch. Come on. I've had conversations with other guitar players about that solo. You're just like, forget it. That's a game over moment, as a fellow musician, you're like, you can't top that, brilliant.
Well,
Really.
we have a Elliot Shannon House who was around at that time and played in two different bands with Michael. And he pulls out the ebow. The ebow was a something that Michael was an absolute master at. And we're not the original Sleepers, and we don't want to just try and completely recreate it. But we do have every song from that EP in our repertoire. We might not play every one of them, but we do play all of those. Plus a song called "The Mind" from the first album, which Paul Draper had a
Hmm.
hand in writing, and then um, Paul also has brought in a couple of the really really old songs that were never recorded, but came from that 1970, 78, or 79 era.
Hmm.
So, and then we have new songs too. We've got some wonderful new songs. So that's kind of what's going on.
Excellent.
I've got other projects too. I have a band out of Los Angeles, which was an old San Francisco group called Los Microwaves,
Mm.
and we're I don't have to practice with them that much because they all live down there. But we're starting to gain some popularity, and we're doing East Coast, well, I should say New England tour coming up in October. So I haven't been on the road with a band for a number of years, other than maybe up and down the coast. So this is going to be a lot of fun.
That's my neck of the woods. So we'll have to, my people will talk to your people and we'll have to get together.
Well, that's true. I've got let's see, I've got Brooklyn with the Bush Tetras, Philadelphia, Richmond, Virginia, Catskill, New York, and East Hampton, Massachusetts, and then another show in New York, I guess.
Okay.
So,
East Hampton
so
will be the one.
cool,
Yeah, yeah,
cool.
definitely. Yeah, and as I said before we started recording, I adore the Sleepers. One of the great bands just of history. I've had a little bit of a push and pull trying to get some interviews with some of the guys for that, but maybe that'll be rectified at some point. And Tuxedomoon, I've always just been fascinated by. They're very much one of those bands that the listener has to discover on their own. Tuxedomoon has never struck me as a band that is out there, pushing things or promoting things particularly well. They're just doing the art and they'll leave the breadcrumbs over the span of 45 years and people can find them. It's like if you go to a great bookstore and you're just sort of rummaging through and you find a book at the bottom of a box at some point, then the cover looks interesting and you read it and it reshapes your entire life. You know, that's kind of like when you discover a Tuxedo Moon record because you're not going to find it because Facebook is telling you to buy it. You'll find it because they'll just be out in the wild and you'll encounter it, and from what I can tell, a fascinating bunch of people too. The legend is when Reagan got elected, Stephen Brown and Blaine looked at each other, went, "Yeah, we're leaving," and they went to Europe and have stayed there. At least that's the legend. I don't know you probably know better than I do, but
Well, they were based in Europe for quite a while. Blaine lives in Greece, and then Stephen lives south of Mexico City.
mm.
And apparently, Stephen shut his eyes and spun the globe around, and then pointed and picked a spot, and that's where he moved to.
Good for him.
Yeah, he's got a. I think I don't know if he still has it. He has some recordings out under the band Nine Rain, and
Mm.
they're pretty interesting. Blaine and Steven still get together and perform.
Mhm.
Uh, Steven goes over to Europe and plays with Blaine, and uh, Peter, the bass player, passed away a number of years ago. Before Peter passed away, I was in contact with him, and he sent me um, pretty much everything that he recorded that I play on, even just bad rehearsal tapes. So I've got all that stuff stashed away. Um, I don't know if I'm making too many mistakes. I don't really want to listen to it, but but Winston Tong is still around,
That's great.
and and when he performs, I didn't see him last time, but I generally go and see Winston perform. He's a little bit older,
Mhm.
and I think he's pretty much the oldest one in the group. Um, because he was actually in the original San Francisco cast of Hair, the play, and so we we get to when I see him, we even talk about old stuff like that too. So yeah, he goes way back, and he's such a sweetheart too. Um, he performs with just a electronics wizard, and the electronics guy, Alex Rudis, he's also does the San Francisco shows when I play with Los Microwaves.
Hmm.
So there's even a little connection there. Everything just sort of spins around, and everybody just kind of knows each other. Down in LA, we have there's a pretty tripped out band called Nervous Gender,
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
and we have um, we have Matt in our band from Nervous Gender when we play down there, and I believe that's who we're going on tour with when we do our New England tour. And Nervous Gender these days is a wild band, and you look at Edward up there on stage, and you go, he's possessed like a demon, stalking the stage in crazy clothes and just everything. And off stage, he's just like the sweetest guy on the planet.
That's great. Well, I'm really happy to hear that Winston still performs. Um,
Maybe once or twice a year.
yeah, that's
And
great.
things, as people get older, it's a little bit harder. Like Fritz from the Mutants, we've got a show booked. I believe it's November 20th, and Fritz lives somewhere out on the East Coast, and he's going to come out for the show. Yeah, we're playing on the 20th in Albany, California, and um, he's 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 an older, he's definitely an older musician, and you've interviewed Fritz, and when I talked to him one time, he told me that his first recording was he was playing drums for a band called the Del Airs, and I looked it up, and that his first single came out in like 1964.
Mm.
So man, the guy goes way back. I loved seeing the Mutants back in the day too. I mean, I really thought that they were. You listen to their music, and it just doesn't sound like any regular old punk band, but they were thought of as punk. And
Mm.
now people look at them and they go, I guess we're going to call that art punk. But they
Right.
were just a punk band along with the Offs and the Dead Kennedys and Flipper and Toiling Midgets. Well, they're a little later. And Avengers, all these bands.
Yeah, and I love all of that stuff. And as I said, we could do a multi-part series, I'm sure, just talking about all, pick any of the bands we just mentioned. We can probably go for quite a while. But before I let you go, I did want to mention one that you played with that we haven't covered, and there are actually several we haven't gotten to. But I wanted to mention Fang because in recent years, Sam has brought Fang back. I saw them in New York, I guess about 3 years ago. Met Sammy that day. Struck me as a very nice person, actually. So he seems to be in a good place. And that's a story and a history that the viewers can look into some other time. But you got to tell me about the Fang bit, because where does that fit in chronologically to the other stuff? Was this post Sea Hags? Had to have been, right?
Oh, it definitely was.
Yeah.
But we have to back up just a little bit, because there was a point when I left No Alternative, and this was 1982 maybe, and I thought, you know what, I want to play with some younger guys, and so I want something fresh and some younger guys. So we got together, and Sammy was our singer, and I named the band Shut Up. And the reason I named it was because there was a cool Stranglers song. It was a flip side of a single, and it was going through my head. And I said, "How about Shut Up?" And everybody thought that was a great name. So that's kind of where I met Sammy, and we had a little band which played a couple of shows. And you know what? I realized I just couldn't play with younger these younger people. They were like punching each other like little high school kids and stuff, and I'm like, you know what, no, I'm gonna do something else. So that's how I met Sammy, and we hung out quite a bit. He was part of the kind of the Berkeley punk rock crew. they were all a little more hard edged than I was, maybe so to speak, with just more like street punks than I was. But they were all friends of mine. The people in verbal abuse fit into that category, and a number of other bands. The Boneless Ones was another great group who's still performing. Uh, um, I knew Sammy, and I'd see him over the years. He formed the original version of Fang. I was a big fan because it was Sammy. He was a friend. That first EP came out. The second EP came out. They had the song "The Money Will Roll Right In." It was great. A little bit later, Sammy asked me if I wanted to join Fang, and I had just started working with Brian Gregory from the Cramps in a band called Beast, and I said, "No, Sammy, I just got this other thing started. It's not really going to work right now. It's probably a good thing because I found out later that all those guys were getting into harder drugs too, and I later on I was around people that did them, but I didn't do them." Um, so I went ahead and was playing with Beast for a while, and then Sammy had to go to prison for uh, for killing his girlfriend. And when he got out, the whole idea of playing with Sammy, was some real mixed feelings. A really good friend of mine, Josh Levine, we'd played in a notorious band called the Insaints together. We also had done this thing called Not Flipper, which was Bruce Luce from Flipper and Michael Belfer from the Sleepers and myself and Josh, and we did one really good show where we played all Flipper songs with Bruce singing. Mary St. Mary came and did some backups. And so yeah, I got to play all the Flipper songs live too with Bruce Luce. So anyway, Josh was one of those Berkeley punk rock kids, and he approached me and said, "Look, Sammy's out now. Do you want to do this?" And I was like, "Yeah, let me talk to Sammy and see where his head is." And I sat and had found out how he felt about what had happened and his experiences that and what he'd gone through, and saw the genuine remorse about what had happened. um, and he was trying to pull his life together. And if morally it didn't feel right for me to do, I wouldn't have done it. But um, I I went ahead and we worked up a set of songs, which a lot of them were initially, the older Fang songs. And our first show was really kind of scary. People were really, people who hadn't like sat down and talked with Sammy were were like, that guy should still be in prison.
Mm.
And one time I was driving home from work and I was listening to our local radio station. They were having a talk show about Sammy and why he should. And somebody said, that guy ought to be picking up trash by the side of the freeway and stuff like that. But they didn't know that, Sammy didn't advertise this, but he was going out and, volunteering to, feed the homeless on a Saturday and stuff like that. So he was actually giving back to the community at that time. But he didn't really advertise that to everybody because he has this Sammy Town imagery of a bad boy. So what happened is we basically wrote this whole album called American Nightmare. And if you were ever have a chance to listen to the lyrics or read the lyric sheets of that, it's such an absolutely personal album for somebody that has just left prison and his whole brain is halfway still there, hanging out with people, prisoners for a long time, you're and then out. If you think about what happens in whatever it was, 5 or 6 years in the 90s, the stuff that happens in 6 years in the world,
Hmm.
a lot happens with technology, and all of a sudden you get out and the world's different. Like 6 years, everything's changed. So if you ever get a chance to read some lyrics in the album American Nightmare, I recommend it to everybody because you'll get a real sense of what's going on inside of somebody's head. We did that. We did a few 45s, and then I left. I left the band. My ex-wife just couldn't handle the fact that I was playing with Sammy, and she's giving me a real hard time about it. Um, we got divorced, and I joined Fang again. I quit the band because we were playing in Seattle, and um, you know, we would sometimes attract a really violent crowd, and there would be a lot of ex-cons that would come to the show. And I left because somebody had gotten knifed at the show, and inside, I just said to myself, I want to play shows where everybody comes out feeling good, not where somebody's in danger of losing their life.
Yeah.
And it's just I can't, with my conscience, and I mean I love playing those songs, but if somebody's going to get stabbed at one of the shows, then I mean we all had to hide in the back and unload everything while the police were there, and I just never found out what happened to the victim, but or anything, but we got back to the Bay Area, and I drove to Sammy's house, and I said, "Look, you know, I just I've got to leave because I can't in good conscience have this happen." Um, Fang played the other night with Fear, maybe about a month ago, and I went to the show and had a wonderful time. And and when I see Sammy, he's got a whole nother band. I don't really know anybody else in the band, but a lot of people from here in the Bay Area come out to see the band.
Cool. Yeah, they were good when they came down to New York. Like I said, this is probably 2021-ish. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I have a good friend of mine is a mutual friend with Sammy, and he brought him out. He books a venue out in the city, and Sammy was out in the street. It was a hotter day, so there's tons of people coming out of the club between bands, and Sammy's standing there, and I'm thinking, well, do I say he was standing amongst a group of friends of mine, so we're all kind of together, and I'm like, I don't want to not say hi to this guy, but I don't know how he's like, dealing with crowds and, where his head is as far as how people see him because of his past. And so all these thoughts are going through my head as I'm extending my hand to introduce myself to him. Like how do I, get through this? And he was great. He was cool, very, kind of quiet, but very nice, respectful, very polite. I just said a few kind words about his band and, he seemed very nice. And yeah, look, I'm all for anybody rising above what they have to rise above, and that guy certainly had a hell of a lot. So if he arrives at this place in life where it's positive for him, more power to him.
Well, and then the stigma after all of these years. I mean, you can never bring Dixie back, but um, the whole stigma about where some people are just never going to get over what he did, and they just won't come to the show. But there's a lot of people that love the music. They know what he did, but it's controversial. A lot of times you have to justify these things in your mind. But for me, I sat down and talked to him even before we played, and I found out where his head was and everything. And he was he was a junkie at that time, and um, a friend of mine just said, you know what? It's junky people doing junky things,
Hmm.
and people snap. And we're all human, and I never got into the heroin thing, and at this point, it's pretty unlikely. But um, you can't really erase the past. You just have to deal with what you just have to deal with the future. And I think that when he plays and performs, he's still bringing a lot of fun to people. I mean, people just sing, "The money will roll right in," and oh, you see a whole crowd of people singing it, and I got to play all of those songs with Fang lots of times. It was a
Yeah.
lot of fun.
Yeah.
It,
It-
you know, with any band, I got to say, it's a lot of fun until it isn't.
right.
And um, that's kind of the way things are. And it's really easy for me to join a band, but sometimes it's kind of hard to leave.
Mm.
So um, that's kind of my philosophy is it's got to be fun, and it is fun. I'm still doing it. I'm still doing it with 3 or 4 bands, or maybe 4 or 5. I don't know.
Well, you've got a tremendous history, and I love, like I said at the very beginning, I love that the Sea Hags collection's coming out. Again, for the viewers, called Dead and Gone, comes out September 12th on Liberation Hall. I will include, available links for people just to get it, through watching the video and check it out. Um, it's been a great pleasure having you on. Like I said, any of the bands that you played in can probably lead to a devoted podcast in and of itself. But I appreciate you coming on, sharing some words with us. And I want to make the point too, at the time of this recording, which is August 23rd, today's my 25th anniversary of interviewing fellow musicians. So I'm glad I can ring in that anniversary with you, sir. Thanks for,
Happy anniversary, Joel.
thank you.
It's it's been my pleasure.